Welcome all to the July webinar here at Atumos. I'm your moderator, Rusty Hall, and I'm glad you could join us today for the July edition of the Atumos webinar series. Today's topic, 5 tips to increase your webinar success. Our presenter today is 4-time Marketo champion, Amanda Thomas. Amanda will have time at the end of today's webinar for some Q&A, so please put your questions in the Zoom Q&A panel there. We will get to those as time allows at the end of the webinar. Feel free to ask any questions about the topic here or any kind of questions you may have had about your own webinar experiences, and we will do our best to answer those. We understand that the majority of people these days are working remotely, streaming remote in a remote environment. So please bear with us if we have any technical difficulties. We will do our best to remedy those and get back online as soon as possible. I'd also like to say that there will be a recording available of this webinar along with the slide deck coming out post-webinar. We'll send that out to an email, so keep an eye out for that after we're done here today. That'll be coming to you shortly. And I'd also like to say just thanks again for joining for the July webinar. That being said, I'd like to turn it over to Amanda Thomas, our 4-time Marketo champion today, who is going to tell us all about the 5 tips to increase your webinar success. Amanda, you can take it away.
All right, thanks so much, Rusty. Great introduction. I'll add a little bit to my background here. Like Rusty said, I am a 4-time Marketo champion. I co-lead the Houston Marketo user group. I have about 7 years of experience inside of Marketo specifically. I have presented at Summit virtually this year and then last year as well. And I usually discuss things around nurture. And part of nurture is kind of starting with a specific channel or offering, and one of those great things is webinars. And obviously, this topic is very topical. Now that all live are webinars, marketing and MOPS teams specifically are churning through these webinars at a very fast pace. And so I wanted to reach out and kind of address some tips that I know have been useful in my practice on the brand side, and then also tips that I've recommended to clients about webinars to get registration up and also to get attendance up or to even increase engagement throughout a webinar. So I'm very excited to go through these tips, and that's all we have really on the agenda. We'll have some Q&A at the end, but we'll go through each of the 5 tips that I have. Each one of these tips honestly could be its own webinar. You can go into so much detail and background into each one of these, but I want to keep it a high level enough to keep it around 20 to 30 minutes and not talk your ear off, and have time for that Q&A. But I also want to dive a little bit deeper, deep enough so you can walk away with some action items or to-dos after this. So we'll just jump right in with tip number 1. The first tip I have for anyone churning out these webinars, and even just getting started with webinars, is understanding that you have data to leverage, data provided by the actual webinar platform. And what I mean by this is with different webinar providers, you can get a different set of data, but some of them have the same exact data that they're going to share with you every time. That data is registration and attendee information. Obviously, you can expect that data to come through each and every webinar, no matter what webinar platform that you have. Other data points that you can get is your engagement analytics. So whether they asked a question or they added a comment, if they made a hand raise, these come through as different names depending on what webinar platform or provider you're using, but they're all telling you the same kind of data as to like what their actual engagement is. With GoToWebinar specifically, I know there is actual data on active listening, which is really great. So if they're actually minimizing their tab once the webinar is started, that information can be seen within GoToWebinar, and anything that can be seen can eventually make its way into Marketo. So it's really good data that you can leverage and have for follow-ups, for planning your next webinar, for understanding what topics kind of resonate. And it's just really great data to have. Also, I mean, for targeting, for segmentation, so many things that you can do with this data. Other data points is webinar runtime, start time, end time, polls and surveys. And this next slide is how you can actually use this data. So like I had just mentioned, anything around the actual engagement analytics, so the Q&A, attended versus no-show, of course, but you can personalize your follow-ups. And side tip or extra tip here, I have tested attended versus no-show as to follow-up, and it doesn't make a big difference separating those two emails out and following up differently. So I definitely do recommend just sending the same email to both audiences, unless you are doing something very unique that you think is calling more attention. And of course, every company is different, so I recommend testing it yourself. But I'd be curious to see if you get different results. Time in session and active listening. So can you be cheeky and say something, kind of cute and smart in a follow-up email based on whether they were paying attention, so to speak? What kind of questions can you address in that follow-up email? Like, here are our top 3, asked questions within this webinar, and here are the answers to them. So integrating that Q&A into your follow-up plan, sending out content that is related to those questions that were asked. Also using this data to plan your next webinar. So a lot of these webinar platforms will allow you to have surveys and also polls. So a post-webinar survey can be sent out automatically. That's just asking them, was this a relevant topic? You can modify what kind of questions are actually sent in that survey, and then you can use that data to plan your next topic. And then poll results, perfect for data enrichment. So having like a pop-up poll during the webinar and having people answer some questions like, what industry are you in? Or what is, how many years of experience do you have in Marketo? These types of things can really help and go a long way with data enrichment, and then just provide you with data that can be used in multiple ways in the future, which is really great. Okay, tip number 2 is promotional plan. I'll probably dive deeper than all the other tips because I have opinions on this one. But I really do think that a lot of what goes into having a successful webinar is around your promotional plan. Everyone puts together some sort of promotion and has promotion for a webinar, but is this methodical? Is it based off of actual data? And where do you kind of start with planning? Hopefully I can address those questions here. So everyone to start off with a webinar timeline. This should definitely, on your MOP side of your marketing department, should sit there with based off of what they have to do in order to get a webinar live for registration. So I always recommend this kind of timeline. Is that 6 weeks out, you're actually getting that webinar requested from, your product management team or your channel marketer managers. You're getting that request entered in 6 weeks ahead of the actual webinar go live date or the date that the webinar is held. And this is to ensure that you have enough time for promotion. The less time you have with promotion, the less registration you can expect and the less attendance you can expect. So always make sure you have enough time to actually promote the webinar 4 weeks out. And again, this is just it's just like a recommendation when it comes to what I'm actually saying happens on the fourth week and third week and all of that. But you want to keep promotion alive, and you want to make sure you can leverage each one of your channels without exhausting those channels as you promote. So that's why you definitely do want, at least 4 weeks of promotion, so you can get the maximum results out of each one of your channels, and get the maximum number of registration. So leveraging your channels. So I've seen it time and time again where webinars are 90% promoted through email, but there are other channels that you can use. So having pop-up banners on your website, or suggested content after someone fills out a form and gets their PDF that they requested. Use your social media platforms, obviously email marketing, but also remember that webinars are great for driving net new leads too. People that are interested at an industry level in what you have to say about a certain topic. And email through Marketo obviously goes to people that already exist in your database. So to acquire new people, use your website, use social media, use your partners, use paid media. I would suggest with paid media and ads, only using this if it's worth it. We all know paid media, digital ads are expensive, and only use it if it is worth the cost that you're putting into it. Meaning, if you have a huge live event, well, it's usually live event, and now you're taking it to the web, I would say, go for it. If you used to have digital ads for that major live event, but now it's on the web, go for it. Or if you have something that is like a series to register for, something that's gonna, be up for a while, that registration page, for sure, go for it and just see the results. And that's how you'll measure that. But just make sure you're actually leveraging each channel available to you for promotion, and understanding when you're going to use each channel within the promotional plan. Reporting, again, within this tip number 2 of your promotional plan, make sure you are consistently reporting on how you're getting registration, by what time. So this chart here shows, week 1 of promotion, how many registrations did I get here? And then what channel did those registrations come from? I have seen in my experience that, your first week of promoting, or about 3 to 4 weeks out from your webinar, you're going to get a good amount of your registration, probably like a third of it. Same thing with week 2 and week 3. It's going to really drop off on week 4. The week of your actual week 4 of promotion is usually, like the week of the actual webinar. So that's usually used for like reminders, things like that. Not a lot of people are coming in and signing up for your webinar last minute. They usually plan their schedules out before the week of. So just make sure you're capturing this data, so because you're the best judge of your company. Your company is the best judge of what is actually going to work. So capture the data on how many registrations you're getting from what channel per week of promotion, to make sure that also, we want to make sure if we don't get those social posts that we need for promotion, we're going to miss out on 30% of our registration. So you can, use this to make sure that if you have other players or other people that you work with that are in charge of like social media, and it's not under MOPS necessarily, then you can use this data to make sure that they prioritize the promotions that you're asking for. It's also really good to make sure that you're getting that request. So then when you send that timeline around and say, hey, MOPS has an SLA for webinars and it's 6 weeks, you have this data to show them why you need all 4 weeks of promotion. All right. Okay. So the next tip I have for promotional plan, of course, Marketo is very heavily related to emails and email promotion specifically for webinars in this case. So I have some best practices. Make sure that your subject line is short and you actually include a date. This is going to help that open rate. And along with this, use the pre-header text. This kind of, I see this kind of appeasing the people that want or request a very long subject line. If you let them know, hey, we're shortening that down to this, but we'll put the rest of your subject line in that pre-header. This is kind of like your second chance of getting someone to open it without just relying on the actual subject line specifically, and making sure you can kind of appease your requesters as well. So definitely take advantage of that pre-header line. And then the CTA button, I have tested this, whether it is at the top or in the middle of the email, and you're going to get more registration and more click-throughs, more form fills if you have a CTA button at the top or in a banner image. Again, you can keep that at the bottom too, have it in both places, but absolutely make sure you have it at the top of the email. Make sure you include when, what, and who in every email. People do relate to images of actual people. So make sure you have your speaker image in the email promotion as well, and use regularly scheduled emails for promotion. So if you have a newsletter or a blog, something that sends on a weekly or monthly basis, make sure you have like a little line in there as well to give an additional source of promotion. And that way you're not completely exhausting a channel and getting a bunch of unsubscribes because you're pushing a webinar. Testing. So there's a lot of testing that can go along with a promotional plan, and make sure you don't have to test every time you're, putting together your promotional plan, but I would suggest if you can, then do it, because if you have enough hypotheses about doing something differently, then make sure your testing is in the promotional plan itself. Things that you can test are listed here: some social promotion, email promotion, and web promotion. Just playing around with your images, what hashtags you're using on social, where you're placing your CTAs and the email promotion, different banner images, maybe using some dynamic content for promotion. Just make sure you test what you're promoting and how you're promoting to make sure you're constantly optimizing. Tiara Riga, she's also a Marketo champion. She just presented to the Houston Mug last week on some testing that you can run for webinars. And that was around like emails and registration pages and a lot of testing, how you go about testing, what you can set up, some tests that she has ran. So really big shout out to that presentation. We'll make sure that a link is in there. So if you need to dive deeper into how to actually set up testing and get some ideas on what to test, you can have that link. So we'll make sure that our follow-up email to this includes that link to that presentation as well. All right. Moving on to tip number 3. So again, I went pretty deep into tip number 2 on promotional plan. This one is your follow-up plan. And very similarly, we have a timeline. So just like you have a timeline for your promotional plan, please make sure you also have a timeline for follow-up. And this can vary depending on what your webinar is actually about, who your webinar is being hosted with. So are you partnering up with another company or, an industry leader or something? Depending on how you're actually leveraging this is going to guide your actual follow-up. But have a timeline set out, and ask for this information when someone is requesting from the MOPS team. And if you are that person requesting, just keep this in mind. What do you want to send these people after this webinar is actually held? So make sure you have something put together with a timeline. And this doesn't need to be all brand new content or anything. Like, it doesn't even have to be brand new emails. It can be something like, oh, this relates very closely to a nurture that we already have set up. So my follow-up plan is, and timeline is just to put them in this nurture that I know is going to answer the questions that were asked in the webinar and provide some good content that's related. But yeah, just make sure you start off with a timeline on follow-up and some best practices I have here. Do you have content for a follow-up? These are questions to ask while you're putting together that timeline and deciding what is actually going to be sent to them after the webinar. Is the content you're promoting already in a nurture? If it is, can we just put them in a nurture? End with a contact form CTA. So this is nurture in general, I guess, getting on my soapbox here. But the point of nurture is to make sure they're getting to the next step. And a lot of times that next step, especially for marketing and those that are revenue focused, is to pass along or make that handoff to sales. And the primary way to do that from Marketo is to push them to a form that is going to alert sales, which is usually your contact or demo forms. So make sure you're ending your nurture or ending that series of webinar follow-up with an actual call and action to get in touch with sales. And relate it back to the webinar as much as possible. If you can, if you're going to have unique follow-up emails, make sure that you're kind of tying it back. And send it from the speaker or the moderator. Be like, hey, yeah, thanks for attending my webinar. Here's more information on the questions that were asked. Include a play button. I see this all the time. I see follow-up emails that don't have like a action image, so make sure you have a play button over the recording, or the image is a CTA in itself, right? And your eyes are going to draw to this image, so make sure it's clickable and have that play button, make it clickable. And another tip around following up and around these webinars is make sure your topic will be relevant, like what you're actually following. If your follow-up plan goes 4 weeks out, is what you're saying after 4 weeks actually relevant to that webinar anymore? Just make sure that you're keeping the relevancy and you're having a purpose within the actual follow-up. And it's not just to say that I can check this off the list, we have a 4-week plan. And if the information that you're providing in that webinar, or the information that you're sending after the webinar, is actually relevant 4 weeks from now, then make sure you put it in your nurtures that exist today as well. Or send it off to your sales team. Make sure they have it so they can, respond to some emails, or, have something new and exciting to present to prospects to get people to re-engage with them. So if it is relevant, make sure it gets kind of like timeless, make sure it gets put into a nurture. New piece of content to add. Alrighty, so tip number 4 I have here is to optimize your registration page, of course. We want to make sure we can support demand gen, and webinars, again, like I said earlier, is a good source for some lead gen, especially if you are leveraging your other channels. So the optimization of the registration page is really important to make sure you're getting people to actually click that submit button and fill out all that information. So the best practices we have are listed here. You can see no navigation bar at the top of our landing pages. We have a register now button, which is just going to refresh this page and make you fill out that form. And then our only other thing that you can click that will take you away from this is the actual Atumos logo. We just make sure if you're really searching hard for our homepage, we have it there for you. But make sure it's just a centered one call to action. The form, as much of it as possible, just make sure you can have above the fold. Keep it as short as possible as well. And then image of the speakers, again, people relate to people. So if you have images, this should, make it more personal, that they actually want to like fill out that form. And provide just a highlight of the topic and make sure you include why it's important. So why it's relevant, why it's important to them, and then just highlight that and play around with this. Again, there's a lot of testing that you can do, and I think that's my next slide here. Yep. Okay, so there's a lot of testing on where you place your speakers, your length of your description that's next to the form, whether you have a form header or not, and that is what's like listed here. So whether you have this or not, or what you actually say in that, does that matter? Lots of different things you can test. And again, that presentation will send you out the link. If you want to deep dive into testing, great presentation again to run through and look at. Progressive profiling, or additional pop-up fields. I know this has been tested a lot in the industry, using tools like Clearbit and things like that. If you have it disabled or enabled, how is that affecting your registration? And then landing page test groups. This is a feature within Marketo that I think is underutilized. But you can set up your landing page test groups and make sure that people are, going to one page over another randomly from one email invite. So it's definitely a good feature of Marketo to use, and that presentation will dive into how to actually set that up as well. Okay, so the last tip that I have is speakers and topics. And yes, I realize how meta this is, but make sure you choose the right one to increase velocity throughout the funnel and conversions. You really can have an impact with webinars, not just lead gen wise, but actually getting people from one step to another. A lot of MQLs for a lot of companies are attributed by webinars and people interacting with webinars and video. So definitely speakers and topics can relate a lot to this and can make a big impact on that. So best practices around speakers and topics. So for specifically your ideas for topics first, obviously they need to be relevant. Is it timely? Does it relate to what is actually happening in your audience's roles at this point of time? The most downloaded piece of content on your website, that can be a great topic. Do you have a webinar on it yet? No? Then make a webinar about the best, the most downloaded piece of content. Obviously that's working, and putting it into a different type of content or a different way to consume that same, topic is great. It just means more people, interacting, which is what you want. The best-selling product, so if you have a big product line, go for that. Make sure you're not, putting a bunch of time and effort into something that isn't doing very well in sales or something. Make sure that it's going to be successful. And then topics to move the funnel. So this is where sales can come in. Sales teams are great for anecdotal evidence around, why people buy and why they don't, and why people continue the conversation and why people drop off. Getting that information and trying to use that as a topic for your webinars is very beneficial, and can really help keep that funnel going forward, and keep sales happy as well. Same thing for speakers. I mean, all of those things I just talked about, the same thing applies. Is your speaker relevant? um, but your speakers, do they have industry leaders? You want them to be people that are respected within the industry that you're marketing to. Leverage your partner relationships. A lot of companies have partnerships these days, and make sure you leverage them and have them, a person from their team come and speak with you on a webinar. Customer webinars are great as well, especially for prospects. They want to hear it from the horse's mouth that this product works and they've had a good experience, or that implementation was easy, things like that. Customer webinars can be really great and go really far. Okay, speakers make the difference, and that's why this is that's why this is a tip in the 5 tips, is they will increase your engagement for Q&A, especially if you have someone outside of your company. We did some reporting on that previous webinar. Thanks to our speakers on our previous webinar. They definitely made the difference. When you have one or more third-party speakers that are involved, we got 2 times the registrations for that webinar. It increases sales engagement as well. There's more people kind of raising their hand, engaging through Q&A, that are asking for follow-up and wanting to talk to sales on the next steps, because they get that that industry information. It's not as biased as of an opinion if it's just someone from your company talking. It's other people interacting, just goes a long way. So probably one of the best tips in this presentation is to make sure to have a speaker that is well respected within the industry. And if you can get them third party, that is even better. So yeah, that was it for my tips. That was my last tip. And I'll open up to Q&A. And I do want to plug that we do have MopsCon coming up in September. This is a great virtual event that has a lot of third-party industry leaders speaking and presenting on various topics around marketing operations. So I'm sure there'll be a link for the follow-up of this webinar to register for that. And then if you're too shy to pop in and ask a question now, feel free to contact me directly. All social at Hey Amanda T or / Hey Amanda T if you want to enter it directly into the URL. And my email is athomas@atumos.com. That's how you can contact me directly. But I'll pass it over to you, Rusty, if you want to open up Q&A.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Amanda. Great tips. And I really appreciate the shout outs too to the previous webinar where I was hosting there. So thanks for that, me, Jay, and Jeff. But awesome tips. And as you stated, very appropriate for the times that we're in, since webinars have ramped up and become such an integral part of our marketing and nurture strategy. So we are opened up for Q&A. I'd like to remind everybody, just go ahead and pop that in the Zoom Q&A panel if you've got a question that you'd like to get in there and get answered. We have a couple here that we're going to start with. But we do still have several minutes here of Amanda's time, so we want to use that as efficiently as possible. So starting off, more of a technical question that we have here. In your experience, have you found that there's one webinar provider or platform that integrates with Marketo easier than others? Or is there one maybe that we should avoid when we're looking at signing up for a webinar platform provider?
Mm-hmm. That's a really great question. In my experience, there isn't one that's like easier to integrate into Marketo over another. Marketo luckily has pretty good integration setup. I would just say like Zoom recently had changed the way they're doing like webhooks and stuff. So it just depends on your level of customization that you're looking for from the start. If you are okay with like a launch point integration and just leveraging that launch point integration that exists between the webinar provider that you're looking at and Marketo, all of them are going to work pretty fairly the same. And the level of customization is can vary, I would say. So just kind of understanding or knowing how you're going to leverage that data, if you're trying to do like a custom object or not, things like that can guide you as to like looking into all of very specific features within each one of those webinar platforms. But all in all, I'd say for the most part, they're, I would say, pretty much the same integration wise.
Great. Okay, good information there, and especially from somebody who's seen multiple platform providers. So fantastic. We've got another question here. This one's actually interesting. It's one that I think everybody kind of struggles with. Love your timeline for the planning and getting all of the email and promotion out multiple channels. But one of the things I think that a lot of us have struggled with. Here's a question that we got in around. What's the best way to kind of increase attendance? So we do typically see, a drop off from registration to attended. Specifically, there's people that just want the recording. But do you have any tips that you could kind of throw out there around like reminder emails? Is there a good cadence or other ways that we can get people to actually show up once they've registered?
Oh, yeah, that's a good one
I
because I
know.
am guilty myself. I'll register and then, sometimes I'm like, I'll just watch the video. I got really busy. But I think that really one of the best ways to combat this is to have a speaker that is like, I don't want to miss out on this, kind of like the FOMO, activating FOMO within your audience. I don't want to miss out on this because this is the speaker and I know all these other people are attending, other people in my industry, and they're going to have a leg up on what this speaker said, over what I did. And maybe they'll implement practices faster than I can. So I think kind of like leveraging or going after that fear of missing out, it could be beneficial. How you do that, I would say test, test, test. I'm not sure exactly how you would do that much. I mean, with social media, I would say get your partners to share like, hey, I'm attending this. Get industry people that are respected in the industry saying like, hey, I'm attending this is definitely something you don't want to like miss out on. Also, when it comes to like reminder emails, I would, there's of course the standard that's like the day before and, an hour before. Definitely try like a few days before. Depending, a lot of webinars, are held like in the middle of the week. So you probably don't want to send out a reminder on a Friday, but something that's like more than a day. But just a few days heads up. Absolutely. I would definitely recommend that. And, test it for sure. Absolutely. Test as much as possible. Try sending out like whether you do 3 reminder emails versus your standard 2 and see if that works.
Perfect advice for trying to get people there. I know that's something that everybody kind of struggles with is that drop off between registered and attended. So
Mhm.
testing and some more reminders. We've got a question here that's actually related to kind of engagement at the end of the webinar, which we're at the end of the webinar in our Q&A. But here's a question that comes in around like success of kind of the call to action at the end of the webinar. Ian's actually asking, have we had success with, or have you seen success with like scheduling a sales follow-up or a demo at the end of a webinar, or just broadly, what can we, kind of expect for like a CTA at the end of a webinar that would kind of
Mhm.
drive somebody to the next step in kind of the prospect journey?
Mhm. Yeah, I think it's I think that's great if you have like a PDF or a handout or something that you can attach and promote to an actual webinar. So whether that's like a worksheet or something, they can take down with them and like go implement right away. I think that's great to have. By the time the webinar is done, I would be surprised if there are a lot of people that actually want to continue talking or listening to someone talk right immediately right after. So I think a lot of the follow up actually happens after the webinar and not necessarily like in the last 2 minutes of the webinar. As for getting people to engage again, most people are like, okay, now I got to get back to doing this, back to work. But I do think for sure, like we have here on our Q&A slide, always have something there that's like, hey, here's a next step or a next thing that we would like you to do. This is something else that's beneficial to you, and that can be very closely tied to the webinar that or the topic that you're presented, or it could be something that's kind of related that we just feel like you can get a lot of value out of. So definitely on your Q&A or your ending slide, have another CTA for sure. And then if you have anything tangent, like a PDF or something that you can attach that someone can download, that's always helpful as well too. But yeah, I would, I'm not sure how many people would actually want to hear from sales like immediately right after.
Right. Which kind of jumps to, we've got two other questions here that I want to get to, so one here is actually related to kind of your tip number one here, which is the leveraging the data. Jim is asking us, what data points can we pass into Marketo, and how could that be handled? Either getting data from a webinar platform into our Marketo instance or into a CRM. How can we get that in there so that we can then leverage that data?
Yeah, so technically speaking, there are various webhooks that you can set up. I mean, LaunchPoint integration will give you, your standard data of registered, attended, all of that, and you can modify that to some extent, but going outside of the actual like native integration that might be offered, you can absolutely set up webhooks to call down certain fields that are available within like Zoom or GoToWebinar, and then put them into custom fields that you have inside Marketo. You can also create a custom object if you want to get fancy about it, and you can just have that set up to house those custom fields and all that information, and then that can be exposed on a custom object, like in Salesforce or something. So you can get pretty advanced with the way that you're passing and collecting that information, and I'd be happy to go a little bit deeper into that outside of this as well. So if you want to follow up, happy to help you or talk through it a little bit more. But I would just say, just first start with, what is beneficial to you. Is having those questions beneficial to you? Then that's something that you want to pass through. So first start with the information that you want to get down from your webinar platform, and then that should help guide you as to what kind of integrations you need to set up to actually get that info.
Well, there you go. Perfect ways to leverage your data and automate it. Marketing automation at its finest right there, getting those data points in there. So last question that we're going to wrap up with is coming to us around lead scoring, actually. So the question here is, do you MQL all of your webinar attendees? And while I feel like that's probably a case-by-case basis based on how your sales team defines sales readiness, could you talk to a little bit about how webinars integrate into kind of basic lead scoring and ways to kind of leverage that to move somebody through the funnel?
Yes, yeah. So of course, it depends and it varies. But from my experience working with many clients, yes, it's very much integrated and usually plays a big part in that threshold if they actually attended a webinar. It's very common that you have people scoring up based on registration and attendance usually, I would say, being about 1/4 of that threshold, the number of points on average. like I've actually seen in my experience. But this again, your company is the best, the best researcher, data provider possible for you to make decisions off of. So I absolutely should. I encourage you all to start with your customers. Did your customers or the people that just signed or bought in the past 6 months, did they attend a webinar? Then yes, it should absolutely be a part of your scoring model. And it should, be probably a heavy part of your scoring model, depending on how close that was to the actual purchase or the actual close on the opportunity, right? So look at your own data and have that, drive the decisions that you're actually making.
Fantastic for response for that too. And I know just from the sales side of the house, you mentioned webinar registrations, but coming from the sales side, the registration's not as important to me because a lot of those are video watchers as it is the attendee information. So if you attended as a sales guy, I definitely want you popping up on my queue. So, but again, varies company to company, but I'm always happy to see that engagement, and it at least gives me a start for a follow-up. So. All right, well, that is all the questions that we actually have in our queue. So, Amanda, I'd like to thank you for your time today. Some fantastic information. I hope that everybody here on our call got some great tips and takeaways that they can take back and launch on their next webinar or virtual event. Amanda, thank you again. And we will be back. There will be more details forthcoming about the August edition of the Atumos webinar series. So stay tuned for that. We'll have announcements and speakers coming out shortly for that topic. So thank everybody for joining on today's call. We're glad you could be here with us today. And hopefully we'll see all of you again next month. Thanks so much.